Welcome to The Man for Texas, Episode 6, The Conscience of a Republic. I'm Brandon Seale. 18 votes. Robert Irion had defeated Isaac Burton by only 18 votes in the race to become Nacogdoches' first senator for the Republic of Texas. The great and bloody and not a little bit surprising victory of San Jacinto, at which the loser, Isaac Burton, had seen action, was still raw in people's minds, as were, for that matter, the massacres at the Alamo and Goliad. Burton had played into it all during the election, and Burton decided to wave the bloody shirt now. He appeared in front of the First Texas Senate in October 1836 to protest the circumstances of Irion's victory. In particular, he claimed that Irion owed his victory to votes from the so-called, quote-unquote, Mexican population of Nacogdoches, whom he accused of being, quote, opposed to this government and consequently not entitled to citizenship, end quote. Where would Tejanos fit into the racial hierarchy of the new Texas Republic? The United States had three very clear categories: whites, blacks, and Indians, the latter two of which were, at least in most of the southern states from which most of the early Anglo-Texians came, not considered citizens and hence not entitled to vote. Tejanos, however, particularly on this mixed-race frontier, were a little bit of all three. A little bit white, a little bit black, and a little bit indigenous, and so defied easy classification. What tipped the scales, however, was most Anglo-Texians' realization that they couldn't have won their independence if not for the large-scale participation and support of Tejanos like Ruiz. Longer-term residents of the state, like Irion, remembered the critical role that Tejanos had played after the law of April 6, 1830, in protecting Anglo-American immigrants to Texas, and none more visibly than the commander of the Mexican outpost in East Texas, José Francisco Ruíz, now the senator from San Antonio. Ruiz and a slight majority of the Texas Senate ultimately supported Irion, upholding his election and establishing an important precedent. On paper, at least, Tejanos would be citizens of the new Republic of Texas. In practice, however, the security of their property and their status as full-fledged citizens came increasingly under threat from waves of new Anglo immigrants. Reports of harassment and even outright dispossession of property soon made it to Ruiz up in the Senate, and he felt compelled to present a poignant, if not poetic, resolution to the Senate at large. Quote, "Your petitioner would therefore respectfully direct the attention of your honorable body to the situation of those unhappy families who, in the midst of confusion, terror, and affright, have been scattered throughout the country, compelled to abandon their home with the loss of all or most of their property, but who will entertain the pleasing hope that they will be permitted once more to occupy their humble cottages, and who are only restrained from doing so at this time by the fear that from doing so they may be again driven away and despoiled of their little remaining all. Your petitioner prays that your honorable body will adopt some measure which will give them the assurance that they may return without the fear of harm or molestation. Let it not be recorded, gentlemen, in the bright page of the history of Texas, that the property of these unfortunate families was confiscated. Many of them, it's true, through their ignorance and through fear have committed errors, but not from any disaffection to the most righteous cause of Texas. Then arrest the guilty, punish the delinquent, or rather, cry and condemn him who is really the enemy of Texas. Let the innocent go free." End quote.
Ruiz is elected as the senator from Bejar, in the area of Bejar, which is like half of Texas at the time, in the first Congress. Ruiz immediately finds himself in a position where he's having to defend Tejanos against these claims of disloyalty, of treason, even when so many fought for the creation of the republic. In fact, Ruiz's first bill is that he's filed is a resolution calling on the Texian army and the Texas Rangers to cease their harassment of Tejanos along the Medina River. And in there, he appeals to history. He tells his Anglo cohorts that history will be the judge of us and how we treat people who were caught up in this dilemma. And he explains it. He explains how the price that Tejanos faced for support of the revolution was much greater than that of Anglos. He calls on them to forgive anybody who may have hesitated in their support. and to kind of unify the country as this multi-ethnic polity. But it's the first civil rights legislation ever filed in Texas.
It wouldn't pass, but the precedent of Tejano citizenship would stand until it was challenged again in 1845 at the Texas State Constitutional Convention. There, Ruiz's nephew and the only Tejano delegate to the convention, José Antonio Navarro, would pick up the torch and defeat a proposal that would have denied Tejanos the right to vote. But coming as it did just before annexation to the United States, it confirmed Tejanos' growing fears that 10 years after independence, they had perhaps simply traded a tyrant in Mexico City for a tyrant in Washington, D.C. José Francisco's son, Francisco Antonio, wanted no part of it.
So Ruiz's son, Francisco Antonio Ruiz, was serving a city councilman for San Antonio when the annexation question was presented to the voters of Texas, and he was a vocal opponent of annexation. He argued distant government in Washington, D.C. would be no different than distant government in Mexico City. He argued that, why should Texas surrender its independence and freedom so soon after achieving it? And he argued strongly that only those who had fought for independence should have a vote. Obviously, we know from history that the vote was in favor of annexation. Francisco Antonio Ruiz resigned. He left and chose to go live among the Comanche.
It was a very open expression of frustration, with Tejanos' diminished status in a Texas now thoroughly dominated by people who seemed to have forgotten Tejanos' heroic role in winning the state's treasured independence. John Herrera was about to walk into the bathroom when he heard someone clicking at him, like a signal you'd give a horse. The courthouse janitor caught his eye and spoke to him in low tones. "Hey, you can't go in there," he told Herrera in Spanish. "There's another bathroom around back. Allá, in the basement." Curious, Herrera walked around the back of the courthouse. The bathroom was easy enough to find. A sign hung over it that read, "Colored men, hombres aquí." The irony was that Herrera and his co-counsel, Gus Garcia, were in that courthouse arguing that Tejanos, despite ostensibly being considered white under U.S. law, weren't actually treated the same as whites. U.S. law in the early 1900s only recognized two kinds of citizens, white ones and black ones. So Tejanos had to be forced into one category or the other. Indians by this time were still a strange other non-class that we won't get into here. Thanks to people like Ruiz, Tejanos had technically always been citizens back since before black people were even, so they were kind of sort of considered white citizens. Yet 70 or more Texas counties had never placed a Tejano on a jury, which was okay according to the state of Texas at the time because Tejanos were white. So an all-white, even if it was an all-Anglo jury, was indeed a jury of their peers. There was a twisted consistency to the argument, though as Herrera's co-counsel noted,
about the only time Cadena wrote that so-called Mexicans, many of them Texans for 7 generations, are covered with the Caucasian cloak, is when it serves the ends of those who would shamelessly deny this large segment of the Texas population their fundamental rights.
The audio in this part, by the way, is from the PBS documentary Class Apart. I recommend it. Just 6 years earlier, in 1948, John Herrera and Gus Garcia had won the court case of Delgado v. Bastrop, in which a judge ruled that segregation of Mexican-American children in public schools was unlawful. And now, along with another attorney, Carlos Cadena, Herrera and Garcia decided to establish once and for all that all Mexican-Americans were full voting, jury-eligible U.S. citizens. It took 3 years and went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the trio of attorneys became the first Mexican-Americans to argue a case before the High Tribunal. A little comically, but also a little sad, their first challenge was explaining to the justices what a Mexican-American was.
The argument, and I said, your petitioner is an American citizen of Mexican descent. And one of the judges asked me, what is that? I thought, you stupid guy, everybody knows what that is. But anyway, I was explaining. And Justice Frankfurter interrupted and said, they call them greasers down there, don't they?
The Supreme Court justices' ignorance of Mexican Americans' plight and even of their existence seemed to confirm Gus Garcia's sentiments from a radio interview around the same time. I'm glad I was able to tell the Supreme Court justices that they were a little confused in thinking we were all just wetbacks in Houston, San Antonio, and everywhere else. Because let's remember that back east, in New York and Washington, they don't understand our problems. They don't know about the 3 million Mexicans who live in the Southwest. That sounds like the long-suffering voice of generations of frontier neglect coming through here. Garcia, like Herrera, could trace his roots in Texas back for centuries, as he told the Supreme Court justices, in fact. And in the end, the Supreme Court agreed with them, ruling in Hernandez v. Texas that indeed Mexican Americans were both full citizens of the United States and protected by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, meaning that they had to be placed on juries too.
Hernandez versus Texas belongs in the pantheon of great civil rights cases, indeed of great American cases. But even more important, it belongs in the pantheon of great moments in American history. This is a moment when a people, long regarded as inferior, organize and demand equal treatment and succeed in that demand. This is an inspirational moment in American history, a moment in which equality is demanded and achieved.
John Herrera's great-great-grandfather, José Francisco Ruíz, would have been proud.
So the life of José Francisco Ruíz, I think, is an essential study in Texas history, in part because it spans this era where Texas is undergoing a rapid series of transitions. There's many others, elites that or folks that you could focus on who may participate in one or several of them. There's very few that I can think of who were so central in all of these events. Well, I think Ruiz's life is a tremendous vehicle to show the Tejano perspective of these events. Their vulnerability on the frontier, their traditions of integrating new peoples on the frontier, their desire to have local control versus distant government, the repeated experience of having their concerns neglected and ignored by government, this idea of self-sufficiency and the need to stick by one another, which I think really highlights the importance of compadres and family and extended families and blended families. Ultimately, this experience is what is the underpinnings or the foundations of what becomes Texan culture. I'm really proud to have been able to have been a part of bringing some of that experience to the forefront, and hopefully for it to be considered and reconsidered and chewed on by future generations, and it having a central place in the understanding of the development of modern Texas.
We like to believe that we live at a time of unprecedented change. But stop for a second and compare what José Francisco Ruíz lived through. The overthrow of the Spanish king, the independence of Mexico, a first aborted independence of Texas that ended in a bloody massacre that killed maybe a third of all the Tejano men in the province and witnessed the assault of nearly every woman in San Antonio. A decade-long exile away from his family, the negotiation of an impossible peace with both the Lipan and Comanche nations, and a journey with each of them to meet the Mexican emperor in the former Aztec capital. The command of a new Mexican provincial capital and their failed attempt to stem the tide of immigration from U.S. Indians and Anglo-Americans. Another risky pronouncement against the sitting regime in 1832, a cholera epidemic in 1834 that killed his mother, wife, and sister. Informal quartermaster duty to the Revolutionary Army of Texas in San Antonio in 1835. Signer of a Second Texas Declaration of Independence in 1836, participation in the drafting of the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, and service as the first senator from San Antonio in the Republic of Texas. Even retirement for Ruiz wouldn't be much more peaceful. In the municipal archives of Marin, Nuevo León, Art discovered that Ruiz was still organizing Comanche horse raids on Mexican military outposts. Ruiz still got roped into being a Bexar County election judge for the 1838 elections, and almost got elected county tax collector despite not even running for the position. In 1839, during a bout of Comanche violence that resulted in the death of his nephew not far from his ranch, Ruiz even took up arms one last time. As a 56-year-old lowly private in a Texas Ranger company chasing Comanches through the hill country. At his death in January 1840, José Francisco Ruiz had seen and participated in more momentous shifts in Texas history than any man alive. He left his heirs and his community at large an unmatched record of service and one humble piece of fatherly advice. Quote, "The most important thing is for you to unite and take care of each other." End quote. Thank you for listening. This concludes our season. Thanks to Art Martínez de Vara for joining us on this episode, and go check out his book about José Francisco Ruiz called Tejano Patriot. You should also go buy the audiobook, read by me under the same name, Tejano Patriot, and available wherever you buy your audiobooks. For more information about Art and his projects, go check out artmartinezdevara.com. And for more information on my projects and past podcasts, you can go to brandonseale.com.